Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Cynthia. Today, I'm interviewing Brett Martin. Brett is a managing partner for Chart Ventures, a New York-based pre-seed seed stage venture fund. Brett is also a serial entrepreneur, having previously co-founded 2 startups. He most recently co-founded Kumospace, a Series A startup focused on building the best virtual office and event software. When not working directly with startups, Brett spreads the startup gospel as an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School. Brett, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to host you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Cynthia. Excited to be here.
Awesome. There's so much to dig in here, so let's get going. Well, first, I actually wanted to start with rewinding back in time and understanding childhood Brett. Did you always know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur and be in the startup and venture space? And if not, what was the pivotal moment for you to enter this industry?
Yeah, still trying to get in touch with my inner child. Yeah, I think I've always been prone to entrepreneurial adventures. I still remember, my parents didn't like video games, so they made me earn my own money to buy my own Nintendo. And I remember I smugly marched my mom to the checkout aisle, and it was exactly $100. And then we got there, and then it was $105 with sales tax, which I had not accounted for as a 6-year-old. My mom did me a solid and covered me, but at that moment, I was like, okay, I always need to have my own money and my own resources. So, grew up doing a bunch of odd jobs as a kid, selling seashells by the seashore. Even at Dartmouth, we won the Tuck business plan competition as a bunch of undergrads. We built an in-game video advertising network, which we probably should have pursued because eventually someone built one called Massive and then sold it to Microsoft for $300 million about 5-6 years later. So, first hard-earned lesson of perseverance. So yeah, I guess I always liked sort of building, and, entrepreneurship is the closest thing to, paid art projects that you can do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also am really into gaming myself, so always love to hear your passion in gaming.
What are you playing?
I play a lot of Nintendo Switch, actually. So it's funny that, Nintendo has been doing so well for decades.
Still here.
Still here and still doing very well. There's a period of your life where you did very unconventional things, like starting an indie rock band and sailing, I believe. Do you think those experiences shaped your style as an entrepreneur and as an investor?
Yeah. So, to be fair, I did my couple years of investment banking right after school, like everyone else that doesn't really know what they want to do. And then I quit, and I had a buddy who had a 30-foot sailboat and that was 50 years old. And you can imagine how well your car would run if it had been sitting in salt water for 50 years. So we took that and lived on it on a year, sailing to South America and back. And I remember actually early in the trip, we were in Virgin Gorda in the British Virgin Islands, and I struck up a conversation with this guy that was sitting there, and he turned out to be a hedge fund manager. And so I was sitting there talking to him, and he was like, "Oh, it's so great that you're sailing. Give me a call when you get back, and we could talk about getting you a job." And I had this realization that I was like, oh, wait a second. I could be in New York grinding and sending resumes to guys like this guy and having them not even, read them. Or I could actually just be where the people I want to be like or with, find out where they are and hang out with them in a more direct fashion. And so I kind of realized that as long as you're doing something interesting that you're passionate and excited about, and then if other people find that interesting as well, then, you'll never be one for a job, because people always are looking for, people who are working on kind of the cutting edge technology, right? I think there's a perception that, it's less risky to work at a big company. But if you think about it, if you work at a big company, you're probably just optimizing some existing well-known process, right? And so if that process becomes obsolete or gets disrupted, then actually, you've spent years learning something that is useless. Whereas if you are, no longer relevant. Whereas if you are doing startups, that you're working on the most cutting edge technology, right? And so it might be more risky. It might not work out. But even if it doesn't work out, you're definitely learning the most valuable skills. And then usually there's someone that is at a big company that's willing to pay for those skills. So I guess, for me, I just never thought it was that risky. And actually it felt less risky than, waiting to be disrupted.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, I think in today's world, things change so fast that it's super critical to always be at the frontier of evolving technologies. When did you kind of start thinking about starting your own fund Charge Ventures? Like, was there a specific moment that inspired you, or was it a long time in coming?
Well, you know how it is when you're like applying for a job, you know how you kind of retrospectively go back and like string your life, which is like often quite random. And then you like tell a through line narrative that makes it sound like you had a plan the whole time. You're familiar with that, right?
Yes. The dots always connect backwards.
Yes. Never done that before. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, I had been, in between startups. I mean, truthfully, after I did the sailing for a year, I did a Fulbright scholarship in Milan. And that's where I met my partner and longtime friend, Thanos Papadimitriou. And we studied, startups. We did research on technology startups there together. And then, I think maybe 7 years later, Thanos gave me a call and he said, oh, we have, a bunch of sort of multi-billion-dollar family offices over here in Europe that want access to early stage US tech, but they're kind of investing willy-nilly off balance sheet and they want someone to come and, structure their family office. And I said, well, my lease of 6 years is coming up and I had recently gotten out of a relationship and summer in Greece didn't sound so terrible. So I went off to Greece for what I thought was going to be a 6-month consulting project. And, here I am on fund 3, almost a decade later.
Wow, that's amazing. What an amazing story to the start of Charge Ventures. Rewinding back to the very first fund, I think I've heard a lot of general partners talk about fundraising being one of the less quote unquote fun parts of the job. What was fundraising like for the very first fund? How did you get it off the ground?
Yeah, to be fair, my partner, Chris Abachi, definitely leads our fundraising initiatives. And so he really deserves, the vast majority of the credit for our fundraising. And so, I think you have to be, talking about Chris, you have to be kind of have very thick skin. You have to be willing to make the ask and ask for money. And, I think it's hard to ask people for money, especially people and that's who is going to fund you in the beginning because, you have fear of disappointing them or fear of them rejecting you. And then what does it mean for your relationship if they say no? Are you still friends? Were you ever friends? Things like that. And so you have to have an iron stomach. And so I think, Chris is a very socially facile guy who is very good at kind of like getting in to the right networks, but he's also a very trustworthy person. You can very much, he's a man of very high integrity. And so I think, a lot of these relationships, I always joke that people think that VCs are like an ATM where you feed in a PowerPoint presentation and you get out $500,000 or $1 million. The reality is that most of the, big deals you hear about are based on either years of metrics or years of relationships. And so, I think our ability to get off the ground with our kind of anchor LPs is a really testament to Chris's relationships and ability to build them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And was being based out of New York a deliberate choice? I think back then, most of the VC activities were still in SF.
Yeah, so definitely was. VC is actually, it's quite competitive industry and increasingly so because, you're all selling the same product, commodity called money. So you have to figure out, what is your competitive advantage? What is your edge? And it's also a networks-based business, particularly for pre-seed, right? Because we're not like running screens that, there's not a list of all the companies that were just formed in the past month. There are some, and we try to mine those algorithmically as best as possible. But, in general, it's hard to find these projects, before they've started. Where we have a competitive advantage is really just a function of time and location in the sense that I grew up it was in New York Tech, 2008 on, which is really when the boom started, was, during the great financial crisis when folks like yourself would, graduate and instead of being bankers and consultants, there were no jobs available. So you had to start thinking about, what do you do if there is no sort of path? And that is usually entrepreneurship. So, we happened to grow up in that period. And a lot of my, friends that I met just bumping around in the early primordial ooze that was New York Tech, are now serial entrepreneurs starting their second, third company, their GPs and major funds. And so I think just being old enough and not getting washed out of the tech market, is our competitive advantage. I think if you look at tech, it's like it churns a lot, right? As we talked about. And so just staying around and alive for long enough, if you can do that, then you'll probably be successful somewhere along the way.
Yeah. And, speaking of that, I think one of the really interesting things about being always at the frontier of new technology is that there's always a new hype cycle around certain trends and certain businesses, especially at the pre-seed stage. How do you keep your head clear and differentiate what's hype and what's real and really find those, companies at their earliest inceptions that have true potential?
I think finding the signal in the noise is a function of getting specific. So, a classic thing that in VC they do is you do kind of like by analogy, right? You're like, this is Uber for X or Airbnb for Y, right? And I think that that's useful because when you're describing something totally new, it's helpful to leverage analogy and reference something that people already know, right? As a starting point. But what I think is important in venture capital is to understand where the analogy is the same and where the analogy is different, right? And truly understanding, what is actually relevant about this analogy and what is completely different is the difference between understanding a business, and having no idea about it. And so that's, I think, one way of doing it is just getting really specific and, me use analogies as a starting point maybe, but then get really specific and get your hands dirty and in the weeds. And so for product, consumer folks, like that's like trying the new products, like really using them and being like getting in touch with your own experience and reaction. It's like, is this something I like? Do I enjoy this? If it's B2B, then, it's probably having a deep domain expertise and having a set of, trusted advisors or customers, doing customer calls and channel checks and asking if people are actually using this. And, is this a tepid customer reference where they're just doing it because they asked, or are they just really excited to tell you about this product because they love it so much? So there's different techniques for different types, categories of investment, but they all kind of, I think, boil down to like getting really specific and moving away from abstraction.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'd love to learn about the latest deal you did and what got you so excited about that deal.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about this company called ShareWillow. The founder's name is Ryan Shank, and they're building Carta for profit sharing. So basically, software for managing profit sharing in profitable businesses, which is, most businesses are not venture backed and not going for an exit, right? So there's this like large underserved market of profitable businesses that, also want to attract great employees and retain them and use economics to do so. And so, Ryan, I think it's a big idea, but honestly, the most thing that gets me most excited about it is the entrepreneur. Ryan is honestly one of the most ferocious sort of founders I've ever seen. I rarely have seen anyone so fast. He's like one of these guys where you sort of think maybe he has a little ADHD and he's not really paying attention when you tell him something. And then it turns out he's actually somehow done it in the conversation. So like somehow by, you ask it, you're like, hey, maybe you should think about doing this or this. And then by the end of the conversation, it's actually done. It's already live. He's like he like pushed the code live on the website and changed the copy or, launch some new blog pages. So it's just really fun to get to work with animals like that.
Yeah. And, I've always heard from investors that great entrepreneurs, especially at the early stage of investing, is like the most critical piece for investing. And I think this is a perfect example of that. Switching gears a little bit to the other hat you wear as president and co-founder of Kumospace, I'd love to dig into your experience there. What was the source of inspiration for Kumospace? What's the founding story?
Well, I was pretty happy marching along, doing venture capital, and the pandemic hit. And we actually, Charge used to throw an angel investing event kind of monthly. We'd have a bunch of angel investors they were friends with. We'd get some drinks and bring them to our office. And the idea was that folks would kind of fluidly network and mingle and share angel deals with each other. And then, the pandemic came and, well, that abruptly ended. Everyone said, well, why don't you bring this online, make it a virtual event? And, I didn't really see what the benefit of doing a Zoom presentation for 50 of my friends every month was. It didn't really serve the purpose, which was to build connections between people. And so we kind of realized that there was no online platform that enabled multiple conversations at the same place at the same time, such as you might have at an event or in an office or maybe in, a classroom with a collaboration or a house party. My old friend and, co-founder and CEO of Kumospace, Yang Mao, he had just quit his job running consumer-facing software at Oscar Health. he was looking for something to do. And so I pitched him on this. And then 2 weeks later, he came back with a working prototype that was unlike any other, consumer product that I had seen. And so things took off pretty fast after that. I think that was June. We launched it in August and had, raised money by Thanksgiving. So it's funny how quickly things can move when there's something there.
Wow, that's amazing. That speed of, starting from an idea and like building a prototype and really getting it off the ground. One thing I'm curious about is that you've previously co-founded 2 startups before. How has this experience been different from the previous 2 times? And what's been the hardest part of running Kumospace?
Well, I'll start with what's the same, actually, which is, we see a lot of great businesses at Charge. And usually when you see something that has, a very large TAM, total addressable market, potential virality and very low cost of customer acquisition, long potential for kind of large contracts and, people to use it for years and, high margins and, possibility of rapid growth, we usually would just invest in it. That's definitely an easier way of making money, I think, than building. But what got me excited enough to be, more hands-on with this investment is that, saw the opportunity to basically use technology to help people have more authentic human interactions online, which is, if you look at every startup that I've ever been personally involved with, whether it's Sonar or Switch or Kumospace, that's what they all do, is sort of use technology to create novel forms of human interaction that try to connect people more closely. And so that's what got me off the bench to go back into entrepreneurship. And then I guess what's different and about doing it the third time is you have an intuitive understanding of what's important and what's not. And the biggest difference is that I'm not CEO, thank God. Yang is CEO and heavy is the head that wears the crown, honestly. Like, I was CEO for my first 2 companies and I'm not on this one. And I'm very grateful for Yang. It's a tough seat to do. And, I just have a lot of work to do. He has to actually make decisions at the end of the day. And so I'm grateful for having a co-founder that I trust and respect. That's really nice.
That's awesome. And I actually think there's a lot of similarities between, at the very beginning of the episode, we were talking about gaming and the role it played in our lives and this theme of having authentic interactions. I think more and more startups and the experiences online should have this sense of entertainment and authenticity to it in a way that, people experience as they play games.
Yeah, that's where people hang out on the internet, authentically, probably more so than, what you're seeing on most social media.
Yeah. And, one thing I wanted to ask about is, how do you think about Kumospace? Like, do you think of it more as a consumer play, more of an enterprise play? I think earlier you were kind of introducing this distinction between how you would approach the evaluating a startup differently depending on which category it falls into. I'm curious what your mental model is like for Kumospace.
Yeah, well, we were just talking about how as a second-time founder, you're so much wiser and don't make as many mistakes. Well, in true classic fashion, we launched with the technology in search of problem, which is, a number one mistake you're not supposed to do. But we kind of quickly learned that, Kumospace has, like I said, kind of 4 core use cases. There's events, there's social, there's education, and then there's kind of for work and productivity. In an office, you have, multiple different people in the same space at the same time, having different conversations and moving between them. And so we kind of zeroed in on that as probably the most durable long-term business. I think virtual events, the comp with real life is quite challenging. I mean, watching Coachella on your laptop versus going to Coachella is quite a distinction. Whereas if you think about the work that most knowledge workers are doing inside of an office, I mean, they're basically just sitting in front of laptops anyway. So, we thought that the comp between remote work and in-person work was actually far less and more overcomable by technology. And I think, obviously there was like a massive spike in remote work during the pandemic. And since then, we have this kind of return to office battle versus work from home, supposedly raging. But if you actually look at the data, it's pretty much stabilized and people are, working, 30% of their time from home. which is massive. Pre-pandemic it was maybe 4%, right? So it's like 7x what it was. And so there's still, a need for, what Kumospace provides, which is essentially, kind of visibility and accountability and availability, right? First, which is, where's your team? Who is your team? What are they doing? What are they up to? Are they there for you? Are they available for you to chat? Then, if you have that, then you can actually collaborate much more effectively. So, tap someone on the shoulder or get a quick answer instead of spending, slacking them. Are you there? Are you there? When can we chat? Okay, let's set up a Zoom meeting in a couple of days. And then we have the meeting and then we say, okay, let's set up another meeting in a week, right? Where it's just like the gaps between decisions is really slow. You can just tap someone on the shoulder to get a quick answer. The average meeting in Kumospace is, 7 minutes as opposed to kind of 30 or an hour on Zoom. So just like saving time by moving quickly. And then I think the final part is that if you are interacting frequently, then that's how you build rapport and build relationships and build, fundamentally culture that drives the company forward or defines it. And, that Kumospace enables all those things to happen. So, I think those things are timeless things. Like we're still, figuring out how that works. We kind of have adapted a new normal, I'd say, in terms of where they're going to work, but we haven't figured out what the how is yet. And, we're excited to be a part of that.
Amazing. I was actually going to ask about sort of how you and the team at Kumospace think about this return to office dynamic, and you totally answered my question, so we can skip that part.
Our latest product is mind reading, actually. It's coming out in Q4.
That was perfectly timed. I think you were kind of starting to paint this picture of what the future of Kumospace could look like. If you're thinking about 5 or 10 years from now for Kumospace, what makes you the most excited about its future?
I don't think it's that different than what it gets me excited about right now. We're doing this meeting. I normally live in New York, work, based in New York. You're moving to New York, but where are you now?
I'm in Philadelphia for school.
You're in Philadelphia and, I'm in California, right? And so the fact that we can have this meeting and be productive and create this content and we can do it from, other sides of the continent, the ability to do that, I think, is so powerful and exciting. I think, if you look, there's one thing I can count on is that if anything can be done over the internet, it will be done over the internet because the unit economics, it's cheaper, better, faster, more accessible. I think that office work is no different, right? We started with books and then now we sell cars and, we started sitting in office 9 to 5 and now we're having meetings from all over the world. And I think, what that could do for humanity, right? It enables parents to spend time with their kids. It, lets, single parents, keep jobs and work new jobs. It lets people who really want to hustle and, work 2 jobs at the same time and, still perform on them, lets them do that and make twice as much money. Lets you work from, travel the world and, instead of having an American 2 weeks off a year, right? You can work from Europe for August, and tack that on 3 weeks of working abroad onto your vacation, if you're fortunate enough. So for both kind of high end and very basic functions, like remote work is one of just a massive creation of freedom in the world. And I think it would be a total shame if labor gave up that freedom. That would be a huge loss for humans.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we're all very excited by the future that you just painted and the ability to have flexibility in the way we work and live. In the very last section of this podcast, I'd love to actually wrap up with a few rapid fire questions where you just say whatever is the first answer that comes to your mind. Are you ready for it?
Let's go.
Awesome. What is a personal goal you set for yourself this year?
Personal goal is to hire a associate at Charge Ventures. So if you're looking for a venture capital job, hit me up. Brett@charge.vc.
Audience, take notes. What is one perspective you have that you think most people would disagree with?
That kind of energy amongst humans can be shared at a distance.
And finally, if you can leave one piece of career advice for students and young professionals listening to this podcast, what would it be?
Don't wait for the data to believe in yourself. Start today.
Awesome. That was such an amazing note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me on Wharton Tech Talks, for sharing your insightful perspectives and your time. I have personally learned a lot, and I also walk away feeling like I'm ready for the next adventure, and I'm sure our audience will be very excited to listen to this episode as well.
Well, thanks for having me, Cynthia. Absolute pleasure to be here. And yeah, let's go.
Awesome.